I used the phrase a few minutes ago, reality outruns apprehension. This is actually a phrase from Moby Dick, not the part of Moby Dick that I will probably end up reading to you tonight. But what I thought would be interesting to talk about, basically because of its intrinsic interest and its recent intensification, is sort of the question, what is reality, number one, and then what's so great about it? And
why bother?
Yeah, why bother? I mean, we really have a bee in our bonnet about reality. When you get out of touch with it, this is considered not a good thing. Reality is the unmoving reference point in a universe of flux to which we are always supposed to go back and re-reference ourselves. And it's a funny concept. First of all, it is a concept. It's not an object with its own interior ontos. In other words, it doesn't have being outside of the culture's assumptions about it. This is the first big news about reality. The reality of the Witoto is a completely different reality from the West European or the Canadian. And yet the reality is, we assume that there is a kind of bedrock, and we call that reality, then everything is referenced back toward that. Well, I wanted to talk about it tonight because it's an incredibly slippery concept. I mean, I would say getting your hands on reality is about as likely as getting your hands on true love. You know, you're always going toward it or looking back at it, but you rarely have it in front of you in the moment. And yet the moment is where we spend most of our time. So we're kind of run ragged by the nostalgia for something we never knew, is what it almost comes down to. So, first of all, whenever we want to talk about something seriously and profoundly, we have recourse to science. However, reality is a term that, if it's used at all, it's used in philosophy, in ontology and epistemology. It is not a concept that you hear very often on the lips of scientists. Well, why is this? Well, it's because science, which is the enterprise which seeks to carry out a complete investigation of reality, has quickly satisfied itself that the beast can't be caged. It's very hard to actually come up with something concrete. And that's an interesting notion that any discussion of reality will tend to come back to. It wasn't until the 1930s that Alfred North Whitehead, in his book Process and Reality, created the great phrase that has now entered the language, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. You've all probably heard this phrase, or maybe you haven't heard this phrase. But anyway, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness is the belief that there is something somewhere which is real, which can be depended upon, which everything else can be referenced back to. And as long as you are victim of this fallacy, you are philosophically naive and probably not at ease psychologically, because, you know, it's like, as I said, nostalgia for something you never knew. The way science's method, which worked very well for the first 450 years, and by science I don't mean science going back to the Greeks, I mean science since the Renaissance. Mathematically based Cartesian materialism is basically my notion of science. Its method is what's called reductionism. This is the theory that if you want to understand something, an atom, a plant, a society, a geological formation, what you do is you take it apart. You deconstruct it. You dismantle it and catalog its parts, and then define their relationships to each other. And then somehow when you recombine all these maps of this deconstructed object, you then somehow possess it. And this worked very well up until well into the 20th century, because it was assumed that matter, which was taken to be somehow a primary constituent of reality, that matter was made out of tiny billiard balls that were called Hamiltonian atoms, and that these distinct and concrete billiard balls could be located absolutely in time and space, and their relationships to each other defined as charge, force, momentum, spin, so forth and so on, and that out of these primary qualities, adhering to these elementary particles, notice these words primary, elementary, that are telling us we're getting close to bedrock, out of this you could reconstruct the world. The problem is, and I won't bore you with this because so many people have, quantum physics showed that these hard little billiard balls were the most tragic example of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. They don't exist. There isn't such a thing. When you go down and down and down, suddenly everything becomes paradoxical. Ordinary logic no longer applies. And, you know, without beating a dead horse, I would remind you that quantum physics, quantum electrodynamics, which is always held up as the greatest intellectual edifice ever constructed by the mind of man, is a complete mess in terms of the aesthetic of its logics, because it requires two logics operating simultaneously. You have what is called ordinary logic, the logic that we as animals intuitively gravitate toward, logic which says things such as, if it is A, then it is not B, if it is now, then it is not then, if it is after, then it is not before. This is kind of logic that assumes concrete objects in a linear time stream. But quantum physics then, to solve the problems it sets itself, it requires another kind of logic, an extremely exotic logic called Boolean algebra. And so what you get when you look at a quantum mechanical explanation of nature is you get what are called aisles of Boole embedded in ordinary mathematical logic. So there are actually transition zones, very distinct transition zones, where you simply switch logics in midstream, literally in midstream, in order to solve the problem. Well, this then gives you a nice set of numbers in an experimental situation where you're trying to calculate the charge of the electron or the displacement value of particles or something like that. But it rests on this completely inelegant switching back and forth from one logic to another as the case requires, which means the human observer is brought in and you get to decide which logic to use, and then you can use one for a few minutes and then switch back to the other and go back and forth. And upon such shifting sand as this, the entire edifice of science rests. Okay, well that's really all I want to say about the scientific view of reality.